Over the last week, we've been talking about the importance of observation, and we've talked a little bit during lab last week about how to actually do it in the field. And then we also read passages from authors, if you remember, from E.O. Wilson and from Conniff and Mary Austin. And we learned about how they rely on their highly evolved skills of observation. So observation is the first step in scientific inquiry. Then we go on to do an observational study, and we'll get back to this in just a bit. So all scientific research is going to begin with observing something, and these observations could be through direct first-hand data collection, or it could be through library research. If you remember from our 3 reading passages, we had E.O. Wilson using his own first-hand observations of the rainforest and what it was like seeing all of the eyes of the spiders looking like diamonds at night. And also Mary Austin, she used first-hand experience as well, because she lived in the Southwest on her own. But then Conniff, interestingly, he is a professional journalist. And I'm not sure if I told you this, but he actually is a professional journalist. So he just used library research to write that piece on cephalopods. So let's say we see this driveway or sidewalk, and we see in that crack we have some knotweed, that xerophytic plant, on the edge there and in the crack. Or we could observe this body of water and say, wow, there's a lot of algae growing on this pond. Or through library research, we could pull up this graph that's showing the percentage of individuals that smoke at different age groups, and it breaks it down with between males and females. And we can make the observation that there tends to be a greater percentage of males that smoke than females in every age category. In each of these observations that we've made, we've looked at something and we've either seen something, we've smelled it, maybe we've tasted it, but we're taking it in. And whether we're looking at, a xerophytic weed in the driveway, or algae growing in a pond, or a graph, all of these observations can either be made serendipitously, which means they just happen, or you could be making these observations deliberately by looking something up, like maybe it's statistics in a library, like this graph we have in the bottom. But in addition to making these observations, I may want to look up more data to learn more about something, or maybe I'll just move on to something else. But scientists, usually they're not going to ignore what they see, and often they're going to develop questions about their observations. So, for instance, if we go back to this knotweed observation example, maybe I want to know how many knotweed weeds will we find in the cracks of this pathway versus how many would we find in the middle of a lawn. Or going back to this picture of the pond, what actually was causing this, right? So were there certain weather conditions that created this algae bloom, this huge influx of green algae growing on top of the pond? And lastly, with this smoking age group breakdown, sex breakdown, maybe we want to know why individuals 20 to 34, why a higher percentage of them smoke than any other age group. And all 3 of these, they seem like they're pretty easy questions to answer. But when you really get down to thinking about it, it's not going to be something as simple as, well, for this we need to find the weeds, we just need to count them, right? We would need to make a plan to collect these observations. We can't just do it. We'd have to maybe create a map of where we'd go, what counts as being sort of on the edge of this pathway, versus what actually is in the middle of the lawn or the grassy area. Moving on to this question, right? How would we collect the weather data? What type of weather data is important? How long would we collect data back from? And here, maybe we think that individuals from 20 to 34, more of them smoke because that's when they're in college. But we'd need to track down the individuals used in this to actually see how many of them actually were enrolled in university or in college. So all of these questions that we have, we need, as I said, we need to plan on how we can collect these observations. And developing these protocols is what we need to do to answer the study question. And we will develop these protocols in lab when we are creating our controlled experiment this week. These studies that I mentioned before with the knotweed, the algae bloom, and the smoking age breakdown, they're what we call an observational study. And these are studies that are done by professional scientists. And often there's a next step after observational studies. So if we just step back for a second, right, we started off with an observation, right? Observation there, here, here. Then we need to develop a question. The question we developed there and there. Then, as I said, we'll move on to design an observational study. Once the observational study is formed, we collect data, then it may lead us to the next step to determine cause and effect. And we call that a controlled experiment. And you probably have heard people use the terms cause and effect many times, but let's just go back to an example to talk about what I mean by that. Going back to this smoking example, right? Maybe we have a really high number of individuals, and them being enrolled in university may correlate with the fact that they have higher smoking rates, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have causation. So we need to do an experiment and set up a control and experimental group. We could look at the smoking rate of individuals that are in university and then find a group of individuals, the same number of them, who are not enrolled in university, and then look at the percentage of individuals that are smokers. And in addition to that, we'd have to control all of the other variables, right? And if we control all of those other things, and then we still see some causality between participation or attending university and smoking, then it can lead us towards this idea, that being a college student is having an effect on smoking rates. Going back to our pond example, maybe we think that the algae is caused by the rain that's upstream of this pond, and when there's lots of rain, it causes the nutrients to flow down to the ponds, and that's what's causing an explosion of the algae. Well, we'd have to maybe set up a couple of ponds, and in one of them block the flow of the nutrients down, and then in another pond allow those nutrients to flow down, and then look at the size of the algal population to see if in fact the flow of nutrients and rain is what's causing the population to grow in size. So at the beginning of this week, we are going to work on observational studies. We'll set up those observational studies, and then from there, use the information to create a controlled experiment. And that's all I have for you. Bye.